Hey class, Mr. Wagner here. Welcome back. We're going to be jumping back into our notes on page 12, and let's just review a little bit. You should have finished this coloring on page 12 of the leaf structure, and we're going to be jumping into the notes on the bottom of page 12, so let's go ahead and do that. And let's talk a little bit about cell structure. So we're going to have a whole unit coming up where we're going to talk everything about cells, a whole unit on cells. But we have to have just a little bit of an introduction, talking about some of the structures of a cell and how they're different, especially in a plant and an animal. So most cells have three basic parts that are visible under a light microscope. They have the cell membrane. That's what separates the inside of the cell from the outside. They have the nucleus, controls activities in the cell. And they have a cytoplasm, a mixture of fluid and organelles between the nucleus and the cell membrane. Just as an analogy, in other words, if you, as a human being, were a single cell, your membrane would be the skin. That's what separates everything inside of you from everything outside of you. That would be the cell membrane. Your nucleus would be your brain, because that's what controls all the functioning going on inside your body, just like the nucleus controls all the functioning going on inside of a cell. And the cytoplasm would be all, not just your blood, but all your guts. Everything inside of you, all the organs, all the other stuff, all the guts, for lack of a better term, inside of you. Just like in a cell, cytoplasm contains all the other stuff going on inside of a cell. All right, let's see what we got. And let's see. Plant cells have some components that are not found in animal cells. Three things, or there's actually two things and one that's just very different. So, cell wall. A cell wall is a rigid layer outside of the cell membrane that gives structure to a plant cell made of cellulose. That's what makes trees incredibly hard. You can't just go up and punch a tree. If you punch a person, you can sink your fist in a little bit, but a tree is extremely hard. Why? Because it's got a wall around the membrane. So we have our cell membrane, and then for plants, outside of the membrane is a cell wall, and it makes it very, very rigid, very, very hard, which is why we use things like trees to build things like buildings. We use wood and lumber to build buildings because it's extremely strong. Chloroplasts, they contain the pigment chlorophyll, and that's what gives plants its green color, chlorophyll. It absorbs energy for the sun for photosynthesis. We're going to be talking a little bit more about that, photosynthesis, but just know that chloroplasts do not exist inside animal cells. Animals cannot make their own energy from the sun. Only plants can do this. And so chloroplasts contain chlorophyll for the process of photosynthesis. And finally, vacuoles. Now, animal cells do have vacuoles, but they're usually much, much smaller. They're like small little closets that store things. Inside of a plant, a vacuole is like a giant warehouse. It's large. A storage area inside of the cell, found in some animal cells, but in all plant cells, it's usually much, much larger. So a large, large storage area inside of a plant cell, whereas animal cells may have small little storage areas, and not all of them necessarily have them. All right, let's take a look here at this picture. See if I can move my picture down here out of the way. Plant cells and animal cells have their differences. You need to be able to draw these two cells with all the details. So take a look at this. I would not be surprised if something like this appears on a test or a quiz. Four things they have in common. Four big things. The nucleus controls the activities of the cell. Cytoplasm, that's the guts, where chemical reactions happen. The cell membrane, that's what separates the cell from the outside world, controls what gets in and out of a cell. And finally, a last one we haven't talked about is one of those guts, one of those organs is called the mitochondria. And mitochondria are very important. They're the energy, the energy plant. They make food and energy for both animal and plant cells. They're the power plant. That's where energy happens. Now, over here on the right side, it says the plant cells, there's three things that they have, only plant cells have. And we see them again, rigid cell wall, made of cellulose, gives support to the cell. The vacuole contains a cell, looks like that says, I can't read what that even says, cell sap. SAP, a weak solution of sugar and salts, also a storage area. And finally, the green chloroplasts contain chlorophyll for photosynthesis. All right, so make sure that you're able to see something like this and know the difference between them. Let's talk a little bit now about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. All right, how it first started. There was a gentleman by the name of Jan van Helmont. He was Belgian. He lived 1579 to 1644. Think around the time of Martin Luther. That'll give you a good ballpark. And I'm not going to have you read this whole thing. This is basically what he did. Was he took a plant, placed it in 200 pounds of soil, soaked it with rainwater, planted a willow branch that weighed only 5 pounds. At the end of 5 years, the branch ended up weighing 169 pounds. And so what he did was he took the branch out, took off all the soil, weighed the soil. The soil ended up being 200 pounds. So he started with the same amount of soil and he ended with the same amount of soil. The difference was the plant went from 5 pounds to 169 pounds. So somewhere along the way, the plant picked up 164 pounds. And he wanted to know, where did that come from? Where did it come from? Could have come from nutrients, but if it came from the nutrients from the soil, then we'd expect the soil to weigh less. So he did water it, but I don't think he put that much water in. And so how did this happen? And so that led him down this road where here's basically an example of what happened. 5-pound willow sapling, it grows up to be 169 pounds, 200 ounces of dirt, and 5 years later. So what caused this huge dramatic shift? And the answer to that was photosynthesis. He was able to realize that plants can make their own food. It occurs in these little things called the chloroplasts. Photosynthesis literally means synthesize, means to put together, and the word photo means light. So using light to put things together. All plants go through photosynthesis, have chloroplasts, regardless of their color. The majority of them are green. But regardless of their color, all plants that undergo photosynthesis have chloroplasts. Photosynthesis takes place there. And finally, the last part says, estimated that plants produce roughly 300 billion tons of food each year. So without plants, life on this planet would not exist because all animals either eat plants or animals eat other animals that eat plants. Or animals eat animals that eat other animals that eventually eat plants. That's how it works. So it's basically they're the primary producers and necessary for life on this earth. That's the way God designed it. And he did a great job doing that. 300 billion tons of food each year in photosynthesis. Here's the equation. You're going to have to know this. You're going to have to know the equation for photosynthesis. All three, first one is in words. Second one's going to be chemical formula, and the third one's going to be balanced chemical formula. So it looks like we have carbon dioxide and water. It's interacted by light from the sun, and it produces glucose and oxygen. Let's look at what the chemical formula looks like. CO2, that's the chemical formula for carbon dioxide. Water's formula, you already know that, is H2O. We need 54 photons of light. Photons are a way to measure light energy, 54 of them. And we produce glucose. You're going to have to memorize or know this formula. C6H12O6, glucose. Glucose is a fancy word for sugar. C6H12O6. It should be easy with the 612-6 and the CHO. And then finally, it also produces carbon dioxide. Also produces oxygen. I misspoke, produces oxygen. And the balanced chemical formula says that we need 6 carbon dioxides, 6 waters to produce 1 glucose molecule and 6 O2 molecules. Also notice this. The plant needs carbon dioxide at the beginning. And when the plant is all done, it's going to give off oxygen. You know what's kind of odd? We give off carbon dioxide when we breathe, and what we need to breathe in is oxygen. Almost like plants and animals are in this symbiotic dance in which plants give us oxygen, we take that in, we use it. We get rid of carbon dioxide when we breathe out, and plants say, hey, we'll take that carbon dioxide, we'll use it to make more glucose and make more oxygen. So there's a natural balance between animals and plants in that plants produce oxygen that we need, and we produce carbon dioxide that plants need. Again, beautiful way in which God designed our planet so that plants and animals live in perfect harmony, providing for each other. Make sure you know all 3 of these formulas. They will be on the test. All 3 of them, please. The word formula, the chemical formula, and then the balanced chemical formula. And balance simply means that I have to have 6 carbon on the left, I have to have 6 carbon on the right. I have to add up all my oxygen on the left, I have to have exactly that many oxygen on the right, and so on and so on. So they're all balanced. All right, let's talk a little bit about this picture. This is a leaf practice quiz. So we already did our drawing of the leaf. This is pretty much the same as what we had in our drawing. We had our epidermis and chloroplasts, our spongy cells, airspace, guard cells, stomas, lower epidermis, veins, palisade cells, and the cuticle. So this would just be a way to practice. I wouldn't be surprised if there's going to be some picture like this on the test or on a quiz coming up. But this is just a practice quiz so you can quiz yourself to make sure you know it. Again, part of the practice quiz again, making sure that you can write down and know the 3 different forms of photosynthesis. All right, looks like we are on now page looks like we're on page 14 in our note packet, talking about the 2 phases of photosynthesis. There's 2 ways or phases. One is called the light phase. It's called light because it needs light energy. If there's no light, this phase cannot happen. And the second one is called the dark phase. Just because it's opposite of light, it does not require light, but if there's light there, it can still happen. Just remember the light phase, have to have light. Dark phase, you could have light, you could not have light, it can go either way. Okay, those are the 2 different phases, light and dark. The light phase is converted, energy is converted into a chemical energy called ATP and NADPH. ATP is the basic form of chemical energy. Just like our basic form of currency, there's lots of ways to buy things here. You can get something by working for it. You can get something by trading somebody for it. But in most cases, if you want to obtain something, the best thing you do is use cash. Use cash or your debit card taking cash out of your bank. So cash is like currency. The basic form of energy that all life uses is called ATP. That would be the currency or the dollar bills that are used to transact energy, ATP. And then the other one is called NADPH. Not quite as important, but you should know it. What happens is chlorophyll absorbs the solar energy. Water, ADP, notice there's a difference. AD means adenosine di-2-phosphate, and ATP is adenosine triphosphate. Those are what those letters stand for. So it starts with ADP, 2 phosphates, and it ends up picking another one, turning into ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And then you also have something called NADP+. These are the reactants. The reactants is everything that's on the left-hand side, and then as you go across with the arrow, you have your products. The products are ATP, NADPH, and oxygen. Those are the things that are made. It sounds a little confusing. Don't worry, we're going to go through this, and we'll have something for you to work on next week also about cellular respiration and photosynthesis, just to make sure we understand it really well. All right, so here's what happened. Energy from the sun splits the water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen. 2 water molecules must be used together because oxygen can never be alone. As soon as oxygen splits, it always hooks up with another oxygen, which is why we write it O2. We never have just plain oxygen. Oxygen is something called diatomic. It always hooks up one oxygen with another oxygen. It's never one oxygen floating around. It does not like that. It will not exist that way. Instead, it will always hook up with a second one so that you have O2, 2 of them hooked up together. Okay, so you always have to use 2 water molecules to get 2 oxygen at the same time. Hydrogen is used to make the NADPH. That's the H on the end. Remember that we originally started with NADP+, but we're going to use that hydrogen to add to it to make it NADPH. Oxygen will later be released. A change in charge provides energy to attach a P phosphate to the adenosine diphosphate to form adenosine triphosphate. So there are the labels again, adenosine triphosphate, that means 3 of them. Diphosphate means only 2. Most important high energy compound in the body is ATP. That goes for our bodies also. ATP and NADPH store energy. They're like batteries. Okay, this is where we get the energy to move muscles and to think and to send nerve impulses and to breathe and do anything else. It all comes from ATP. So this is a summary. So we have water, adenosine diphosphate, and NADP+. We react that with oxygen. Oxygen, ATP, and NADPH are formed. Those are the products. Hydrogen is used to make the NADPH. Oxygen will later be released. ATP and NADPH store energy. That's just a rough summary. I got my reactants, I got my products, the hydrogen goes to make the one, oxygen's later released, and the ATP and the NADPH, they store our energy that we use. Okay, there we go. Let's talk now a little bit about the dark phase. Dark phase. Remember, it can occur in the dark or it can occur in the light. The only thing you need to remember is light phase requires light. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Because that water molecule has to be split. The only way it can be split is with sunlight. Photons from the sunlight splitting the water molecule. All right. The dark phase happens in the light but does not require light energy. I do not need light to split any water molecules. Dark phase is also known as the Kelvin cycle, first described by a gentleman by the name of Melvin Kelvin. How'd you like to have a name like that? Melvin Kelvin. Kelvin cycle. All right, here's what happens. 2 3-carbon molecules combine to make glucose, C6H12O6. Carbon and oxygen come from the carbon dioxide, and the H comes from the NADPH. Energy to do this comes from ATP breaking down into ADP and NADPH breaking down into NADP+. So what happens is the ATP kicks off a phosphate, it becomes ADP, and when that happens, when it kicks off the phosphate, it releases a little burst of energy. And the energy is what's going to be needed to combine these molecules together. We're also going to get a little bit of energy when the H gets kicked off of the NADPH and turns into NADP+. When that happens, a little bit of energy is kicked off, and the energy is needed to make this combination happen. All right. So here's a picture of what it looks like. The light phase is on your left with the light reactions. Water being split by sunlight produces, it looks like, NADPH and ATP, and then oxygen is kicked off in the process. From here, the ATP and the NADPH go into the Kelvin cycle, also called the dark phase. And in that, sugar is actually made, starch, sugar, and it takes carbon dioxide to do that. And in the process, its products are NADP plus and ADP plus another phosphate. So then it goes back again with those things back to the light phase. It hooks the hydrogen onto the NADP plus, and it hooks on that other phosphate to the ADP, and then it goes around in a big cycle round and round and round, with sugar being made, oxygen being released, water and carbon dioxide being used, along with the sun's energy. Okay. What are some things that affect photosynthesis? Let's take a look. Shortage of water. So water is needed to be split by the sun. If you can't split water and make those oxygens, then you're not going to be able to make a lot of energy. Second thing that affects it is temperature extremes. Photosynthesis occurs best between 32, that's freezing in Fahrenheit, and 95. So that's the best. Once it's freezing, the water doesn't want to split because it's solid ice. And once it gets too hot, not good for the plant. The water gets all evaporated, and there's no water left to do the splitting. Also affected by poor light intensity. So if you have really cloudy days where there's not much light coming through, not bright sunlight, that's going to affect the amount because it's going to be less water molecules split by intense sunlight. And finally, a shortage of carbon dioxide. So if you don't have enough carbon dioxide, you're not going to be able to have the products or the reactants that you need to make the products. So 4 factors that affect photosynthesis: shortage of water, temperature extremes, poor light intensity, and shortage of carbon dioxide. All right, stages of sugar. Let's talk about that. Glucose is a form of sugar as it is made in plants. We call that glucose. Anything with an OSE ending on it means sugar. OS endings tells us it is sugar. It actually tells us the shape of the molecule and that the ending includes sugar. But there are other kinds of sugar. There's sucrose. Sucrose is a form of sugar as it is transported. Formed by glucose and fructose molecules attached to each other. That's why sap tastes sweet. So when you're transporting the glucose, it's called sucrose. Often we call that like sap, and it's usually sweet in taste, which is where we get maple syrup from maple trees. That is literally the sap from the maple tree. And it looks like we also have starch. Starch is a form of sugar as it is stored. complex carbohydrate. Many sugar molecules join together. So think of this as like a sugar in storage waiting to be used. That's starch. Bread has lots of starch. It's a carbohydrate, complex carbohydrate. That's why bread and pasta are really good for people who are athletes, because it gives you a long, steady supply of stored energy that you can use in competition. All right. And finally, fructose, mentioned above, but fructose is basically the same chemical formula, but arranged differently. So I've still got my C6H12O6. The only reason is in fructose, some of the carbons, instead of being here, are over here, and instead of having an oxygen over here, it's over here. It's in a little different shape, but it's still sugar. It still ends in ose. It's just got a slightly different form. And this is what we can get from corn. You've maybe heard they take corn and they use it to make high fructose corn syrup. So what they do is they take sugar from corn and turn it into fructose. And they'll often use that to flavor like Hi-C or your fruit punches or whatever it might be, high fructose corn syrup.